All right. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pink Line, journey across the world's queer frontiers. To start, a summary, the book is personal accounts of various LGBTQIA+ individuals. There's Auntie, who's a refugee in South Africa, Michael, who is a refugee in Canada, Amira and Maha in Egypt, who later moved to Istanbul and Amsterdam, Pasha, who's in Russia, Zira and Martha in Guadalajara, Fadi and Nadav in Israel, and Liam and other riot youth who are placed in Michigan. And then lastly, the Kothi in a village in India. The main arguments of this is that no social movement grew as quickly. He's arguing that LGBTQI+ movement increased participation more rapidly than other movements because of globalization from the West and influencing other world's politics, and then social media and the influence that media and being able to connect with people increased. Globalization changed how people thought about their place in society and their opinions and rights because of various movements from the West or increasing gay rights in the United States. People across the world began to evaluate their place in society. And a pink line, just for clarifying the title of the book, is a place between increasing integration and building up gay rights, but also shutting out LGBTQIA+. So areas in policies and government that actually have excluded LGBTQI+ from the decision-making process. It brings up conversations of sexual orientation and gender identity. It's a global issue. People across the world experience issues of oppression based on either their sexual orientation or gender identity or both. And it's a constant pull between a traditional viewpoint, which obviously is based in heterosexual relationships, versus a more modern viewpoint, which would be anything that is not necessarily heterosexual or cis, I should say. So chapter 1, the main arguments in this is that policies that are created without data are made out of personal prejudice. So a lot of people making policies and influencing policies may not actually know the data that surrounds it and actually leads to more oppression. The West, which in the book is referenced a lot, referring to the United States, asks for change in Senegal, and they aren't appreciating that. They do not want the West to influence their citizens or policies. And again, that divide between tradition and being modern is really clear within this chapter that fight for those two. So to start off, 2008 UN Assembly condemned violations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And in 2012, Obama goes to Senegal, where LGBTQI+ are being arrested, experiencing acts of violence and discrimination. And the president of Senegal says that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not apply because of traditional values, and therefore LGBTQI+ do not, he makes the argument that they do not fit the definition of human. Ukraine and Russia also joined the European Union. This means that they have to abide by the union's rules, which means decriminalizing LGBTQI plus members. In the book, mostly it's referred to as homosexuality. However, I'm saying LGBTQI plus because it's more than just straight or gay. It's a lot more intersection than that. But that also include Poland, Hungary, and Russia, or Hungary and Russia, that use tactics that actually were to deter migrants from moving there, specifically LGBTQI plus, and blame Western liberal capitalism for increased sanctions on government. Chapter 2, it's focused on Auntie. This argument is that gender identity is not a strategy for getting out of poverty. There's a lot of instances in this chapter where people are being discriminated against because to seek asylum based on gender identity or sexual orientation. Some people think that's a situation in which people could abuse the system and try and get money and the wealth, but actually the stigmatization makes poverty worse within different parts of the world and even here as well. Wealthy Western nations like the US values see people like Auntie as vulnerable and deserving help. This came up when the author discussed different ways in which he helped Auntie and funded a different job for her, had some personal gain there, but he also called himself out on how that may have not been actually very helpful to have this type of white savior complex, and that we should go and personally be funding individuals. He saw an issue with his own perspective. So Auntie is a trans woman in Chiblanka. Not gonna say that right, sorry. She has actually a very strong like family support unit from her old village, and her uncle even made the comment that he suggested making her the female chief, like when he passed away, like her successor, and that didn't seem to bother him at all. He accepted her gender identity and said that there were female chiefs in the past, and like he saw no reason why she couldn't be. So I thought that that was something really amazing that stuck out to me. In 2009, her and her husband were married, and they were arrested for 14 years and put in prison because it was seen as a gay marriage, because she is trans. They did not recognize her as a woman. They still recognized her as a man and made her undergo intense examinations to prove that. In 2006, South Africa was the 5th to legalize same-sex marriage. So she flees to South Africa to escape violence. And there she is brought into a placement, sorry, forgetting the word, starts with an S, kind of like a safe haven of sorts, gender dynamics, who fund individuals escaping violence. However, when she's in South Africa, she still experiences assaults and hospitalization. She begins having a drinking problem. Later, that gets better for her. But even though she has moved into asylum, she still is experiencing a lot of discrimination. Chapter 3. This chapter argues that imperialism from the West created pro-family ideologies that exist in other countries as well as the United States. So during colonization, the US imposed a lot of heterosexual Christian beliefs on other parts of the world that didn't necessarily exist before, and also created that in the United States, obviously, as well. In 2009, the Ugandan fear of the homosexual agenda was used, where it basically incited fear in Ugandan citizens and said that the West was trying to turn everybody gay, and compared decriminalization of homosexuality to bestiality and pedophilia, which exists other times, and we'll get down the line with that as we move through the chapters, but that's not the only time that that argument has been used in a comparison to homosexuality. The Republican side to moral issues. So Republicans typically have Christian ideology, and faith sets the values that exist within the United States. Things like LGBTQI plus rights, that is looked at very differently by conservatives than it is by liberals based on that religious background. In 2010, Obama repeals the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which allowed for military members to be openly gay. And in 2013, the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed in Uganda, which created a wave of violence against Ugandan citizens who identified within the LGBTQI plus community. Chapter 4 is about Michael. The main arguments in this is that the colonization of Uganda in 1888 influenced religious opinions about LGBTQI+, which we talked about previously, and that Uganda is known globally as one of the worst places to be gay. Individuals face a lot of violence, a lot of family betrayal, which we'll get into as we talk about Michael's story. So Michael is a trans Ugandan refugee. He flees to Kenya for asylum after his family sends the military and the police after him. They turn him in. His mother banishes him from church. He tries to go away to a boarding school where his family outs him, and he's sent away from there. He is homeless, and he is sent to a lot of different places for safety. However, here, like in Kampala and Nairobi, neither of these places were extremely safe for him. He still experienced a lot of violence. People would lure him via social media and do horribly gruesome things to him that I don't want to say because I feel like very triggering. But a lot of abuse, being a trans woman, woman. He also experienced a lot of loneliness and anxiety. He felt like he had no friends and no one to turn to, and people that he thought were his friends actually held a lot of prejudice that he wasn't aware of. In Canada, he expected it to be more welcoming. He expected more friends, but his first landlord kicked him out because the refugee service didn't give him his monthly payment yet, so he couldn't pay his rent. And he just continued experiencing discrimination despite trying to escape it. Chapter 5, the main argument is that homosexuality is an inherent component of human behavior, and that gay identity and LGBTQI rights come from Western civilization, like we talked about the United States, and that sexuality is seen as something you do and are as part of identity. He makes the argument in this chapter that people identify with their sexual orientation and gender identity, and therefore it's something that matters a lot to individuals and influences a lot of things. So he goes through kind of the process of gay rights throughout history. So Darwin and Freud codified what sex is and means. And then Carolyn Kurt Bentley in 1869 termed the terms homosexual and heterosexual. Hirschfeld said that homosexuals are a natural variance of development, that being gay is normal, and then talks about Nazi Germany, where gay individuals were required to wear inverted pink triangles. Thought that was interesting. I didn't remember learning that when learning about Nazi Germany, but just an example of how this has carried out throughout history and developed over time. Chapter 6, we focus on Amira and Maha. The arguments here is that LGBTQI plus are excluded from recreational places like cafes. This is very similar to experiences during the American Civil Rights movements, where Black people were also excluded from recreational places, or when entering recreational places were harassed, beaten, and that is what happened in this as well. There's new ways to find LGBTQI plus individuals with technology. The increase in technology has increased connectivity. So Amira and Maha are a lesbian couple in Egypt. They own Girls Cafe after they experienced recreational discrimination, but they had to shut down after a year because it was too much money to keep it going. But within Egypt, the police force evaporated, so there were no more police. However, there was the rise of Muslim Brotherhood, and this created a new regime within Egypt that cracked down on protests, which Amira and Maha were extremely passionate about and active in. And they even went online to try and lure people who were part of the LGBTQI plus community to incriminate them. So that's, again, how technology has influenced how people are discriminating. And they seek asylum in Turkey, but move back to Egypt. Maha gets a conference opportunity in the Netherlands, and she is there for a couple years, actually. And Maha goes to stay with her, but after being apart for so long, they don't last, and they end up breaking up after a couple years, and Amira goes back to Egypt. So that was a bit disappointing to hear. Chapter 7, the arguments here is that there's moral panic around LGBTQI plus individuals. People feel threatened to lose societal values like family and family in the traditional sense, because individuals can still experience family who are part of LGBTQI plus community, and then also things like religion. And a common theme was throughout history is that to maintain support for these societal values, people in power often scapegoat unpopular minorities within their culture and also against like Western culture. So saying like, so Western influence, stuff like that. In 2012 in Iraq, emo is associated with homosexuality, which emo is a fashion choice. However, it resulted in a lot of deaths around this scare that individuals who dress emo are homosexual. And so the death for just emo fashion was 56 to 90 individuals. In addition, there's a rise of political Islam. This signaled need for barriers from moral decay of the West. Again, this Western influence of gay rights, people see that as moral decay as it aligns with their religious affiliation. And in 2018, 6 countries in the Middle East had death penalty for LGBTQI plus members under Sharia law. All right, chapter 8 is Pasha's story. The arguments here is that gay rights in the West open up frontiers for transgender rights movements, and that real womanhood is not determined through childbearing. Pasha is a trans woman in Russia who, because of her transgender identity, she's not allowed to see her son and is actively blocked from him. She is trying to fight the courts to gain some type of visitation and joint custody, but her ex-wife will not let that happen. She says that it could damage the physical and mental health of an ethical development of traditional family values, and the court agrees and rules in favor of her ex-wife. Her son now has been hearing negative information about his previous father, and now refers to Pasha as a nutty dame, being like 8 years old. Pasha is a former sniper and father. Her father encouraged manliness, hence how she became a sniper and became good at weaponry and militia, but also encouraged individuality, which Pasha really appreciates, that she was still able to develop into her own like values. In Russia, Putin's campaign sparked a lot of pseudo-patriotism, which was highly against LGBTQI plus members, and Pasha's ex-wife quickly became a part of this, while she had originally been more liberal and more understanding of different ideals. He also creates new anti-gay legislation, and argues that there's an illness from the West destroying Russia. So that's a theme that's fairly consistent throughout this book, is that Western ideals are influencing. And then when Pasha's son was born, feminine feelings started to rise again that she had repressed during being a sniper and a husband, and was often scolded and ridiculed by neighbors and other people for being too soft on a son, and that a son needs to be raised to be manly and those things, and basically just those really toxic masculine traits where men are not supposed to show emotion, men are not supposed to cry or be soft or talk about feelings, and Pasha didn't agree with that way to raise a man. All right, so chapter 9. The main argument here is that the Catholic Church plays a role in anti-gay and gender rhetoric. So they talked a lot about different policies that were backed by the Catholic Church and encouraged support for, that played a massive role in anti-gay legislation. Gender ideology fights in Latin America were largely from right-wing individuals and Catholic individuals against LGBTQI+, because they found it personal, as it had to do with moral and religious issues rather than political. Latin America liberation theory and pastoral care open to LGBTQI plus Catholics, and meant that over time, within Latin America, the Catholic Church began to become more accepting of LGBTQI plus members. Chapter 10. The main argument here is that families become Mexico's pink line, specifically LGBTQI plus families. In 2012, 1% of households within Mexico had a same-sex couple, and 75% of the 1% had children. So really challenging ideals about what a family looks like. That was the area in which people experienced discrimination. So Zira and Martha are wives in Guadalajara. And they're the first legal same-sex marriage in Jalisco. It's a challenge for both of them to be Sabina's legal parents. They had a surrogate sperm to have Sabina, and right now Zira's name is the only name that they will allow on the birth certificate because there's only a place for the mother and a place for a father, and this in the country does not allow for two female names to be on the birth certificate. This added a lot of strain to their relationship and trying to advocate for both of their names, because they both really were actively involved in Sabina's life. However, in 2018, from all the stress and strain of that situation, they ended up separating. Chapter 11, the arguments here is that LGBTQIA plus movement led to opportunities for advertisements and the ability to make money off of love, as they said. But they also point out the hypocrisy of prioritizing LGBTQI plus individuals when it's suitable for money, but also maintaining policies that are against LGBTQI plus members. In 2012, Puerto Rico Atlantis Events hosted an all-gay cruise, and a U.S. retired police and partner were arrested and held for 19 hours in a dark, bug-infested cell without a toilet. This exposed the different ways that individuals were being treated within Puerto Rico, being LGBTQI plus members. The Dominican education minister decided to investigate the root causes of deviance and increasing homosexuality in schools to mitigate crime and violence. This reminded me of the Jim Crow movement, early days in train cars, where individuals who were being discriminated against were told that they were being discriminated against for safety, for less violence, to mitigate crime, and that false narrative, it comes up here too, where usually individuals are more likely to be victims of crime rather than perpetrators, but that's not necessarily what individuals in power are saying or doing about a situation. Chapter 12 argues that activists are pinkwashing the LGBTQI plus movement. This is meaning like they're promoting LGBTQI rights, but only to draw attention away from issues that are not like enhancing LGBTQI plus rights. So Israel, for example, spent $3 million on tourism targeted to being a positive thing for LGBTQI plus members. However, that was 10 times the government's social service spending for LGBTQI members, and that caused a lot of uprise and obviously upset. It's probably not a good word. For members of the community, and they had to increase their spending on social services as well to keep up and eliminate their hypocrisy. Fadi and Nadav are a gay couple within Israel. Nadav is Jewish and Fadi is Muslim. In 2016, 84% of those who were religious opposed same-sex marriage within Israel, Jerusalem, and 3/4 of the 84% were Jewish. Fadi thought he was opposed to dating outside of his religion, but Nadav respected his religion and his experience, and also recognized instances of oppression that Fadi experienced. Chapter 13 argues that the gay movement opened up frontiers for society and classroom, school boards, the military, and the workplace, and that gender transitioned to a pink line, meaning gender was now something that people were discriminating against, specifically non-cisgender individuals. So the West, again talking about the United States, begins focusing against trans individuals. It's no longer about gender ideology, but now gender identity. And as of 2015, 16% of individuals knew somebody who was transgender or is transgender. However, murder began increasing. In, I believe, 2013, there were 9 murders of trans individuals, and by 2016, there were 30. So over the course of 3 years, a big spike in aggressive violence towards transgender individuals. 2013, the DSM-5 replaces gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria. In psychology, we discuss this a lot. There was a lot of dispute over whether or not that should be included in the DSM-5. The person who advocated that be included in the DSM-5 has really archaic, kind of deeply entrenched in stereotypes, types of treatments for transgender youth. He tells the parents that the parents need to be more overbearing. They need to have a strong father role model or a strong mother role model, and they need to properly learn what their sex matches. But that's not a regarded technique in any way, shape, or form. And the other reason, that a more positive reason for it to be in the DSM-5, which is a diagnosis for mental illnesses book, is that it helps individuals get funding. So trans individuals could get a diagnosis from a psychologist or psychiatrist saying that they have gender dysphoria, and perhaps some of their treatments, like testosterone or puberty blockers, could be used the diagnosis could be used for money towards those things to enhance one's gender identity. In the United States, they talk about the bathroom issue and the sports issue. There was a lot of uprise in early 2015 about transgender bathrooms and individuals using bathrooms that match up their gender identity rather than their sex. And parents, of course, became righteous in this and didn't thought that it could be used for violence against other people, like if somebody was a trans woman, but that's actually sex is a man, then they could use it to violate women. Just ridiculous argument in my opinion. And then there's the issue of sports, women who have higher levels of testosterone having to compete against men instead of women because that's unfair advantage, or again, like trans women competing against women, people saw that as unfair, or vice versa. So just a lot of issues within the United States surrounding transgender individuals and also transgender youth. So chapter 14 focuses that queer is our culture, gay describes the kind of sex we have. In older generations, homosexuality was what you did and gay was who you are. So this kind of goes back to that earlier chapter where the author makes the argument that it has to do with identity. And this chapter is enhancing that argument, but also saying that it's more than identity, it's also culture. And you're not necessarily only defined by the type of sex you choose to have. So to focus on that, talks to Liam, who is a trans high school senior. He underwent top surgery and he's on T for testosterone, but he had to wait until 18 because his mothers did not agree. His birth mother, who is no longer actively involved in his life, she thought that he needed to be taught more how to be feminine and a woman, and she really wanted him to embrace his assigned sex, where his other mom thought that they should be supportive and support him in his journey. However, they both had to come to an agreement and decided that he wouldn't be given permission to undergo any surgery or blockers or testosterone until he turned 18. So he did that. He wants to wait on bottom surgery because it's extremely complicated for trans men. There's a couple different options, but they're not very advanced. So he's hoping that over time they get more advanced. And then Riot Youth holds a queer prom. However, Liam stops going because he begins to feel that he doesn't fit in there, that there's a kind of anti-straight narrative that he feels is imposed upon him, but he is straight. He identifies as straight, but of course he's not cis. So it could be an instance that maybe there is a bit of resistance towards cis straight men, but not necessarily trans straight men. But either way, the quote that I have up there, that's from another Riot Youth member that was at queer prom. Chapter 15, the argument here is that in Western culture, there's only two genders, and other cultures also have a third gender identity. So within the United States, it's very binary, but that binary does not exist all the time in other cultures. Other cultures have a more fluid option, and the individual in this chapter, she even referenced that if she had stayed in the Philippines, it's very likely that she would not have been trans because there was an option for her within the Philippines. Like I said, in the Philippines, there's a gender nonconforming option, and 73% of Philippines say that homosexuality should be accepted. So a lot different of a viewpoint. It's more acceptable to be non-binary than trans because individuals in the Philippines see trans individuals as being deceitful. So again, not sure how I feel about that, but that is like the feelings that individuals in non-Western cultures that have that third gender identity can feel. Chapter 16, the arguments here are surrounding the Hazara community, which is an intersex, asexual, and transgender individual community within India, and also the Kothi, which is described as women's hearts and male bodies. Again, assuming more of a fluid type of gender identity. Attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity have changed within India, and groups like Hazara and Kothi are more generally accepted. Earlier, before the Supreme Court decriminalization of homosexuality in India, the Kothi community was not worried about police. Reference that they could bribe police through sex or money, possession, stuff like that. But that they actually felt more concerned about their families and their familiar acceptance. Also, within India, there's like this myth that the Hazara community are pedophiles and luring children, stealing children, stuff like that. However, they recognize that that's actually not true at all, and that Hazara communities are really like safe havens for runaways, and they usually welcome runaways and rehabilitate individuals. So 3 interesting facts. One was Israel's military. We talked about Nadav, and he served 3 years in the military. And the author of the book found that really interesting and inquired about Israel not having an issue with having openly gay men in the military. And he said that Israel's always at war, and therefore they need everybody that they can have. Like, they cannot discriminate against anyone because they're always at a state of war. And that was just a really shocking response for me because I never thought about it in that context. Like, in the United States, we have a lot of tests and things that individuals have to be or pass in order to go into the military, and other countries, they don't have that because they're in more like immediate danger, whereas the US has more individuals to pick and choose, and they don't have as much war like here on American soil. So I thought that was a really interesting point to bring up. I also thought that the strains on relationships was really like noticeable to me. In almost every instance, couples that we discussed broke up for various different strains on the relationship, and a lot of that I feel like could be attributed to discrimination and oppression and all of that stress that has on individuals' lives. It makes it very hard to maintain an intimate relationship when you're dealing with a lot of stress and discrimination. Also thought the book was extremely well-rounded and gave a lot of information about other groups other than just the US, where most literature can focus on, or just a specific country. He went across a wide range of countries to learn more for this book. So I thought that was something different. Some critiques. Ashley Currier from the Cambridge Press Africa Volume 91, Issue 4, applauded his ability to remain within individuals' lives, which I didn't talk about because this was a really big book and big presentation, so trying to keep it as time sensitive as possible. But he maintained like really good relationships with every individual after the book was even completed, or after he got the general information from individuals. He still tried to keep up and be like, hey, like, how are you? What's going on? And visited different people again. So she applauds that. However, she's curious about the untold stories of other individuals across the Pink Line, just based on geography and maybe their lack of ability, or his lack of ability to get them, or people who may be closeted or within places that is extremely unsafe or rural areas. So she was just curious as to other untold stories, but that gives us an opportunity as activists, as writers, whoever, to fill in those gaps and to expand this. And then the University of Amsterdam, Peter Giescher, questioned that maybe there was too much unity being mentioned in this book, and whether or not trans individuals want to be grouped under pink. I think that word in itself, I feel like that is a bit entrenched in stereotypes. The idea that pink is automatically assumed to be feminine when it's not necessarily. Like, straight guys can like pink. Like, it's not something that is strictly feminine or gay or anything like that. And I felt like that was where that comment came from. But also questioned if trans individuals wanted to be included in the movement. And again, maybe it's just my own personal bias, but trans individuals are still a part of the LGBTQI plus community. And while in the book he said homosexuality a lot, it's not strictly about gay rights. It's about a whole community also. So some questions. In South Africa, we did not touch on the issue of LGBTQI plus discrimination. Is this an area that should be explored when talking about apartheid? Because it wasn't until after apartheid that sexual freedom was actually like brought in to South Africa. And then the second one, some world leaders found that it was too much Western influence in foreign countries. Is this necessary, or is it outside of like the US jurisdiction to do this? How have we seen this in other civil rights movements? So I won't say the answer, but we talked about different times in which the US has stepped in, and also different times maybe through your knowledge that the US has stepped in, and really how is that a responsibility, or do these leaders have rights to say that's too much? So just a question. And that's everything from me. So thank you all so much for listening. Have a great day.